Welcome to the Ethics Alliance conversation.
Hi folks, I'm Daniel Effron. I'm a social psychologist and I spend a lot of my time designing experiments to understand why good people cross ethical lines. Today, in the 10 minutes I have, I'm going to share three very broad insights from my field of moral psychology. So why do people cross ethical lines? Well, one sort of naive view of this is that essentially people weigh up the costs and the benefits. They say, can I get away with this? Right? They say, how much can I stand to gain from cheating? Am I going to get caught? What's the likelihood? And if I get caught, how severely am I going to be punished? This is a model that has actually informed a lot of crime prevention policies. And today I want to argue that it's too naive. It's not psychologically nuanced enough. Instead, the average person, I would argue, cares a lot about feeling and appearing virtuous. But all of us, no matter how much we care about this, are sometimes tempted to act in ways that could feel or appear less than virtuous. And understanding the psychological dynamics of how these competing forces play out, how people balance them, gives us insight into when and why good people do bad things. So I would argue the question that people ask when faced with an ethical dilemma is not, can I get away with crossing this line, but rather, can I do what I want in this situation without feeling like a bad person? So using this question as a jumping off point, I can highlight a few insights from the field. The first one is that people cheat less than they can get away with. You can run laboratory experiments where you ask people to roll a die in private. And the higher the number they roll, the more money they get. They can walk home with cash. But no one sees them roll the die, so they can lie about it and get away scot-free. So the question is, how many people lie? Well, the study has been done hundreds of times in dozens of countries by many different researchers. And again, the finding is that the average person cheats a little bit, not to the maximum extent possible. Why? Because people are balancing these competing forces. Yeah, I want to get something good for myself, even if it means being dishonest. But I don't want to feel like a terrible human being, so I'm not going to cheat as much as I could. One application of this idea is that monitoring employees, for example, to make sure that no one ever is dishonest, it's going to be very costly, often impractical. Sometimes the costs of doing that may outweigh the benefits. I heard recently that Google instituted a new policy for expense reports where when you travel, no one checks your receipts. They figured, there's a cap on how much you're allowed to spend. They figured the costs of processing all the receipts far exceeds the savings because most people are pretty honest.
It's a fairly big question, but I was really keen to hear if any of the panellists have seen a connection between an organisation that is very diverse and inclusive and a more ethical organisation.
So is there a connection between the diversity and better ethics? Is that the nub of it?
An organisation with a broad diversity of gender, of LGBTI, etc. Exactly, and ethics.
Anybody come across that or any?
So I can't think of data that speak directly to that question, but I can think of circumstantial evidence that suggests to me that it's a good hypothesis. So that we know in more diverse teams, people are less likely to assume that everyone thinks the same. They're sort of on the lookout for disagreement. So they think harder about what they're contributing. They think harder about their decisions. Real disagreements and different sources of information are more likely to surface. And these are the kind of things that I would think prevent ethical fading. If we just do what we've always done because that's what everyone else is doing, I worry about ethical traps. If diversity forces us to slow down and dig in and justify our positions and assume that other people might disagree, I think that could help prevent ethical fading.
Just because you've got values and principles in an organisation, is it actually ethical? Like, what do we consider ethical and moral? We know what the research says and how we should treat people, but then within what context?
I mean, just before I throw to the others, one of the key things that distinguishes an ethical approach from a moral approach is that you can be just habitually moral by following a set of behaviours over
Correct.
and over, whereas an ethical approach is always defined by reflective practice, that you think about it, you apply it in this way, and that's a much more difficult thing in some ways to do. And in fact, just if I can spring off that to you, Daniel, you were talking about bringing ethics to the fore and how people might approach the line and things, but what if the question doesn't even get asked? I mean, what if people are so used to a set of customs and practices, they become genuinely unthinking. Why do you do this? Oh, because everybody does it. That's just the way we do things. Yeah. Then, in a sense, the ethical dimension can just disappear.
Yeah, and I think that's what we were talking about with ethical fading. That I mean, one risk is that you have a code of practice, a code of ethical conduct, and back to what I was talking about with moral licensing, that allows you to feel like, well, you've ticked the box. We've talked about ethics. We don't need to think about that anymore. It's on the website, whatever. Instead, really grappling with these values and how they apply to different situations and having that be a part of a routine organizational process, I think keeps the ethics top of mind as opposed to just having a tick box. Insight number 2, people cheat more if they can maintain a positive self-view. So if they can answer this question affirmatively, if they can answer this question, can I do what I want without feeling like a bad person, they're more likely to cross an ethical line. How do people answer questions like that? Can I do what I want without feeling like a bad person? Well, my own research suggests that people look back to their moral track record, to their history, and they look for evidence that they're a good person. And if they can point to good deeds that they've done in the past, they feel like they have what we've called moral credentials. And with these credentials in hand, they can cross ethical lines or engage in ambiguous behaviors and not worry about feeling so bad about themselves. For example, there's one laboratory study showing that expressing a hypothetical preference to purchase environmentally friendly products, something that made people feel pretty ethical, a chance to do that made people more likely to lie, cheat, and steal money from the experimenter in the study. Right? The idea is, I've done something good. I've proven that I'm a good person. I can cross this line without feeling so bad about myself. So what can we do to prevent this moral licensing effect? How can we encourage people to do good things without it leading them to do bad things? Well, the research isn't totally in yet. We haven't solved that problem, but I can offer some thoughts. One is that it should be more effective to emphasize to people ethical commitments they've made. When people make public commitments, they feel obligated to follow through with them. An alternative that doesn't work so well is to emphasize just the good things people have done, ethical achievements rather than commitments. Right? If you emphasize ethical achievements, people feel like they have ticked a box and they may be more likely to relax their striving of ethical goals. To make that a little more concrete, here's a hypothesis. Let's say you work for an organization where a value that people consider very ethically relevant in this organization is diversity. And the organization has made great progress in hiring a more diverse workforce. So one thing they could say going forward is, we as a group of individuals are deeply committed to diversifying the organization further. I would say that would be an effective thing to do from a psychological perspective. An alternative that probably wouldn't work so well would be to say, see how far we've come. You know, our workforce was, 10% female when we started, and now, 10 years later, 30% of the workforce is female. So that's emphasizing progress, might feel like a past accomplishment. Some people might say, oh, great, we've come a long way, tick the box, we don't have to worry about diversity anymore. So emphasize ethical commitments, not just ethical behaviors, regardless of the value we're talking about.
Do you think that the fact that a lot of the ethical good stuff happens at hospitals where people work directly with people is different to ethical bad stuff where people are disassociated from their victims, if you will? And does technology play a part in the increase in bad ethical behavior because now people work less with other people and victims are much further away, if you will, than before?
Yeah, I think the research is really clear on this, that it's easier to act in ethically questionable ways when there's distance between yourself and the victim. I mean, the dark example is it's easier to press a button to kill 100 people than to look one person in the eye and stab them, right? The flip side of this is that people act more charitably also when they can identify victims, right? So you might have noticed in advertisements for charities around that are trying to solicit donations, usually it will be like one crying child. That's because research has shown again and again that that activates people's empathy. The third insight is that people cheat less when ethics are top of mind. So we had this great example of ethical fading. This is something I actually wanted to talk about. The metaphor with ethical fading is that there are bright lines on the floor that we say would never cross. You know, I would never do that. Psychologically, as we get closer to those lines, they start dimming, and then we find ourselves on the other side without even realizing it. One reason for this is in the moment, we're not thinking about ethics. This is a business decision, not an ethics decision. So what can we do to prevent this ethical fading? Keep ethics top of mind. One of my favorite examples of this is a study done by a colleague of mine, Lisa Shu, at London Business School, where I work. She found that people are more honest when they're filling out a form if they're required to sign the form at the top saying everything I'm about to say is true, as opposed to when they sign at the bottom and say everything I just said is true. Right? Why? When you sign at the top of the form, you've made ethics salient. Right? People are thinking about ethics as they're providing their answers. If you get them to think about ethics after the information has been provided, it's too late. So you can implement this sort of signing at the top of forms in your organizations, but more generally, making ethical discussions a routine part of organizational decision-making. Having little reminders around to keep ethics top of mind should be effective. So a few insights from moral psychology, just to summarize. People cheat less than they can get away with. So monitoring is important, but look for other solutions besides just making sure that people don't cheat. People cheat more if they can maintain a positive self-view, so emphasize ethical values, not just the good deeds that people have done, which allow them to just tick the box and move on. And finally, people cheat less when ethics are top of mind, so I would urge you to make ethics a salient and integral part of the organizations. Thanks a lot for your attention.